Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, we've talked a lot about politics lately, especially the Supreme Court. But I think this week it's time to turn our attention a little bit more to cultural issues, really important stories and developments that, if anything, are, I think, upstream from politics.
Yeah, well, listen, I think the idea of things being upstream from politics and that the court is politics, I mean, all these, require pretty careful definitions. The Supreme Court's definitely very much a part of American culture. It creates artifacts like, laws, precedent, so on. It certainly creates or at least embeds ideas into culture through its decision. So it's not always accurate to call these things separate from culture. But there's been a lot of interesting things happen on the cultural side of things, at least over the last couple, I guess, week or so. I mean, we had, first of all, the letter that we talked about during last week's program that was published in Harper's, mainly center-left intellectuals, some big names from Malcolm Gladwell to Salman Rushdie to David Brooks. To J.K. Rowling. I was going to say to Harry Potter, but to J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, Harry Potter signed it as well.
Yeah, no, he actually definitively did not. I think he has separated himself from his creator. If we're talking about Daniel Radcliffe and J.K. Rowling, that's a whole nother thing.
Daniel Radcliffe is not Harry Potter. Don't do that to me.
Oh, man. Listen, there's enough purists when it comes to Lord of the Rings. Are you really a purist when it comes to Harry Potter like that?
I think I'm a little bit of a Harry
enough?
Potter purist. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that. I am a Lord of the Rings purist in some sense, but yeah, Daniel Radcliffe is not Harry Potter. You can't do that.
See, for weeks now, I've been trying to help you shake this, homeschool nerd reputation, but it's over. Like you've just secured that for the rest of your life to anyone.
It's over.
It says the Harry Potter movies are not good enough for the books.
You mentioned an open letter, John, and this week we're actually talking about another open letter of sorts here. This was the one thing that really snagged just the top of my news feed, at least on Twitter and Facebook. Barry Weiss, an opinion writer and editor for the New York Times, has resigned. And she explained in an open letter that her views have actually gotten her nonstop harassment. That's her word, not mine, within the paper, including, quote, constant bullying by colleagues who disagree with my views. They've called me a Nazi and a racist. She follows closely on the heels, by the way, of the ouster of editorial page editor James Bennett, who was hounded from the New York Times after publishing an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas calling for the use of military force against rioters. And whatever you think about Tom Cotton's op-ed, that was a position that, according to polls, the majority of Americans were okay with at that point. So the New York Times is essentially hounding people out of the editorial department who express views that are shared by a plurality or majority of Americans. And so Barry Weiss's letter was just a fascinating explanation of the same kind of cancel culture I think that we saw described and decried in the Harper's open letter. And it was it talked about the culture that's taken hold at the New York Times. And I think my favorite line in her letter was where she talks about how Twitter has become the de facto editorial board of the New York Times. It's like the Times will publish something and then in real time go back and edit the headline and the text of the article or the opinion piece based on how it's playing on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is dominating the New York Times. And in that sense, what that means is that a small set of largely left-leaning intellectuals and I would say busybodies are controlling what was expressed in America's paper of record.
There's tons of fascinating things about this story. I mean, in other words, she basically said the reasons that she was leaving the New York Times were essentially the things that were warned about in the Harper's letter, that even on the left side of the spectrum, this idea of cancel culture. Now, to be clear, Barry Weiss wasn't canceled. She canceled herself by stepping out of this position, which was a remarkable position for her at such a young age. But interestingly enough, she was one of the signers of that Harper letter. But that is an interesting thing to think that America's paper of record is so susceptible to Twitter traffic. But, listen, the communication from the office of the president of the United States is highly susceptible to Twitter traffic. We know that he will both tweet and respond to tweets in real time, middle of the night, or whatever. We know that Twitter can get people fired. We know that Twitter can get people dismissed from platforms or furloughed or whatever else. I mean, Twitter has an enormous power. And it's not one, and that's a remarkable thing, because Twitter itself is not a platform for debate. You literally can't do it. The form limits it. The functionality of this platform. I always tell people, when I speak, if you're on Twitter, you can follow me at JB Stone Street. If you're not on Twitter, don't start. I mean, I just did it the other day with Ryan Anderson. He and I have got a podcast coming out on Monday, looking at the Supreme Court decisions and trying to get kind of a big picture. But it's the same thing. The power that Twitter has. You think of the things that guys like Neil Postman warned about. Neil Postman, of course, the author of a book everyone should read called "Amusing Ourselves to Death," and he was seeing what entertainment culture was doing to our collective abilities to be serious, our collective ability to think. And he was talking, of course, then not about the internet at all, much less social media platforms. One wonders what Postman would say when we see so many of the predictions that he made, or so many of the observations that he made about television, taken to an nth degree by this other platform. Here's a question I have for you, Shane. So we basically have a whole run here, right? So we have a Harper's letter with some amazing people that really signed this thing, asking about cancel culture. Barry Weiss, by the way, has been a participant in cancel culture, and now she was complaining against it. That we can talk about that maybe later. Yeah. But now she resigns. Andrew Sullivan stepped out of his position. Is there a awakening by? I mean, gosh, it's hard to call Barry Weiss and Andrew Sullivan. Sullivan, yes, center left. But a lot of the people on that letter, Michelle Goldberg, for example, also at the New York Times, she's not center left at all. I mean, she's an AOC, at least according to what I've heard from her on the Argument podcast.
Well, in many ways, I think that's stronger. I think the fact that there are leftists who are decrying.
So, is there an awakening?
Well,
you think there's an awakening on the left?
Question. I wouldn't have before that. I was sort of hoping, because I'm a naturally optimistic person. I was hoping
you come across as a naturally optimistic person, Shane. I've got to say that's good.
Thank you, John. Yeah, based on J.K. Rowling just coming out, because she's such an important figure, or a big figure, a well-known figure. I was already kind of hoping, but after the Harper's letter came out, I mean, this is a who's who of center-left intellectuals over the last, I mean, my lifetime certainly, but even before that. Noam Chomsky is an old guy. I don't know how I'd categorize him politically necessarily, but this is, I think there is a backlash brewing. I think it's a significant backlash. And if it doesn't win, it'll put up a really darn good fight, I think, for this heart and soul of freedom of speech. And John, you actually missed a name. World had a great story about National Review's Jeffrey Goldberg, who was hired and then fired basically immediately by The Atlantic before he could get more than a single article out for his views on abortion. What happened was The Atlantic wanted to bring in more diverse opinions on all kinds of issues, like for instance, the right to life. And Goldberg came in there from National Review, which is, of course, a conservative-leaning publication, and cancel culture got a hold of him. In essence, they dug up a ton of his old tweets, a ton of his old articles, stuff he's not bashful about, stuff he defends, like the criminalization of abortion. And then they called endlessly they harangued the editors and board of The Atlantic to fire him. And finally, they ended up firing him. The funny part is, according to World, he predicted this. He said this was going to happen. He's like, you can hire me, but they're gonna attack you over it. And they inevitably did that. And this is not something that's healthy I don't see how you can possibly defend this as healthy. It's not how you arrive at truth. It's not how you defend truth. It's not how you get.
It's not how you build a consensus, right? Yeah. You don't build a cultural consensus on this. You just further alienate people. I mean, for example, no one stopped to ask, for example, is what Barry Weiss is saying actually true, right? In her letter about the New York Times culture. Yeah. I mean, maybe some people did, but I think by and large, everyone just kind of assumed that it was. And if you look at her accusations, which were scathing about the culture there, about the dismissal of anyone who isn't a full-on purist in terms of far-left political views, who just seeks to actually entertain relationships and thoughts outside of the kind of the party line, the harassment and stuff. No one really thought, well, that doesn't sound like the New York Times, right? I mean, people just kind of believed it, which tells you a lot, again, about two things that point to much, much deeper crises in America. First, there's not a consensus on what America is, what kind of nation America has been, what kind of nation America has the potential to be. And, every election, we hear a lot of division, we hear a lot of infighting, we hear a lot of chaos. But one really wonders now, heading into 2020, whether there will be a significant enough majority of Americans who refuse to be governed by whoever wins. If Trump wins on one side or Biden wins on the other side. And this sort of like intolerance, even within one side of the ledger, just makes that question in my mind more important. And then, of course, if you can't trust the press, I mean, again, this is America's paper of record, and no one goes, oh, I bet that's not true. I mean, everyone just kind of assumed that what she was accusing the New York Times of was legitimate. I don't know how to think about that other than there you go. So, in my mind, both of these stories, the Harper's Letter story and the Barry Weiss story, just point to, things that we've talked about before here, but that continue to rise to the surface as very, very important questions about America's future.
We're listening to Breakpoint this week, folks. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories and headlines of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, speaking of the future, we ended our last segment there talking about America's future, but we can also talk about the world's future here. And there was a piece of news this week that came out about the world's future, a forecast, if you will, based on demographic science and based on a long compilation of what scientists have been, demographers have been growing to understand over the past few years and even decades about long-term population trends in the world. And this story came from the BBC. Fertility rates worldwide in nearly every country have been shrinking, and populations in some countries are actually shrinking. And by the end of the century, world population will actually peak and begin shrinking. So this is 23 nations currently, including Spain and Japan, are expected to see their populations halve. That's one half of what they are now by 2100. Countries will also age dramatically, with as many people turning 80 as there are being born by that time. This is from researchers at the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And they showed that the global fertility rate nearly halved from 2.4 in 2017 and up till now. It's approaching 1.7, and the numbers on when exactly that'll happen are sort of vary. But the point is, global population, far from exploding and booming and overwhelming the planet, as we've heard prophesied for so many years, is actually reversing, and at this point will begin trending downward. And many people are receiving that as good news. You had a commentary this week, John, that I think talked about this. Tell me a little bit about that, because it's counterintuitive in a way. We're steeped in this mythology of overpopulation. Why isn't that true?
Oh, that's right. I mean, listen, this is one of those things one of our colleagues, Roberto Rivera, calls a zombie idea. Like, this thing should have died a long, long time ago, and it still rises from the dead. And that's why it was so actually encouraging at some level to see this come out of the BBC. This wasn't this was basically like countries, and by the way, European countries, many of them have looked at this reality of shrinking populations for a long time.
Yeah, they've been
and have tried to solve the
to have
problem.
babies for some time now.
But with only moderate success. The most successful nation, as I know it, is France, and they've rolled out an awful lot of money. But most just aren't, and this tells you that this has less to do with the economy. It has less to do with almost anything other than worldview, just mindset of whether children are a good thing or children are a bad thing. We have a situation now for the first time that I know of where basically every head of state throughout the European Union, with very few exceptions, is unmarried, single, not a parent. That's an amazing reality there.
I didn't know that.
You have a situation in Japan. Good heavens, Japan. They're one of the nations that is highlighted in this BBC article and this study. But there was another study that came out. No, it was on. I listened to a podcast that has a kind of a fact of the day,
Hmm.
and the fact of the day was the median age. I mean, this is an astonishing thing. So the median age of the population there has increased by 16 years in less than 15 years. I'm not even sure how that's possible. I mean, it sounds like it's breaking some law of physics in order to make that happen. But yes,
What is the
it's
median
a
age now? It's like 48.
48. Yeah. So you're talking about past childbearing age. And this is just, this just kind of goes into this whole pot of things we now know. For example, in America, the average age of a woman's first child is now younger on average across the population than the average age of a woman's first marriage. And that's an average across the board. So you start seeing these indicators there. And America is a really interesting story on this, because for a long time, America really was seen as one of the few nations in the Western world that was meeting that repopulation rate of
Mhm.
2.1. That's the magic number. It's probably, by the way, too low. It's
Because
probably
and
2.4.
the reason it's simple, because there's two people and you have to replace yourselves plus a little bit extra for those who, die before they have children.
That's right. And of course, that number is going to fluctuate depending on how many other people in the population aren't having children.
Right. And then they don't have
Uh,
children. Of
Yeah,
course.
that's right. So it's probably closer to 2.4. Some of the better thinkers, I think, have pointed us that way. But the UN, stands by 2.1, so they must be right. So here we have it. That America has been one of the few countries in the Western world for a really long time. But in the last 5 years, our birth rate seems to have plummeted. So we've gone from 2.1 to 1.8 to 1.7. And 1.7, the same folks, by the way, that give us that 2.4 number, a little bit higher number, give us a 1.7 number as kind of the cliff. That's where you are so behind the curve in reproduction that you don't have enough people to marry each other. And so then it just starts tumbling down the hill, and it's hard to recover from. Now, America's been on this trajectory downward. And of course, we're only where we're at because of immigration and homeschooling anyway, right? So you have this,
I actually know all 6 homeschooling families who are single-handedly keeping the fertility rate in the U.S. on average up.
Hey, it's impressive. It's really impressive. I was speaking at a homeschool conference once, and I was just talking to this guy that I met, and I was like, "How many kids do you have?" And he was like, "Only 3." And I was like, "It's only at a homeschool conference where a guy's going to apologize for not doing his part." But the Scandinavian countries have lived well below 1.7 for a long time. France has been the most successful in recovering some of this. But here's what it says about us, Shane, and this is. When you look at those numbers, demographic numbers, it's, as our friend Warren Smith often would say, it's not magic, it's math. Like, it's just, look, you can't magically say you're going to have enough employees to support a retired population if the vast majority of your population is over 80. And that's when their medical costs are going to go up and you don't have enough workers like, that's not magic. You can't wish that away. At the same time, there's a fundamental idea here that children make you think about the future. You're a dad, you know that, right? I'm a dad, I know that. When I think differently as a dad than than I did before I was a dad. It just changes the way you think. Now multiply that across a nation, and a low demographic, a low reproduction rate is the difference between a culture at large living for the moment or living for the future, just like it is for us as human beings, as dads. I often joke, you never hear married men say, "Hey, y'all, watch this." It's always unmarried men that say that before they ride their motorcycle off a cliff. Yeah, this is an unmarried man thing. And being a father takes it to another level of the future. And so these numbers are huge. You can't, this is like gravity. You can't step off this reproduction roof and then not hit the ground. It just is, it's baked into the nature of reality. And it stuns me, Shane, how many students in particular still come to me and say, well, the Earth's overpopulated.
It's a myth that won't die. It is like Roberto says, a zombie idea. John, I think it's probably a little bit overly dramatic to refer to the Children of Men here, the movie or the novel. But if you want a little glimpse, I think, of the idea of a world without a future, what people look like when they have nothing to invest in beyond themselves, that's probably a good indication there, because the idea of a world where nobody can have kids. And we've entered a world where many people are choosing not to have kids. And there's the numbers issue. There's the fact that welfare states are going to collapse because there simply aren't enough people at the bottom of the pile to support the people at the top of the pile. And pensions and things like that are also going to collapse. But it's much more, I think it's much deeper than that. Like you said, it has much more to do with our ideas, how we live, what our values are, where we invest our time, and then even how we think about ourselves. Like, what is it that I'm here on this earth for? Is it because I'm here to make myself happy and get the best toys and the biggest house and win the race and then just sort of die with it all? Or is it so that I can pass on something meaningful to others, whether they're my own children or those with whom I share my community or my country or my church even? Those are big questions, and there's something that children speak into. Children, as we've mentioned before on this program, are signposts. They're visual testimonies and living testimonies of the fact that the future matters, the fact that you aren't the center of the universe, and the fact that you have to give something of yourself in order to make that future come to pass. I love the picture you see floating around on social media every so often of a father and a son. It's just a silhouette, and the father is sort of pulling blocks out of himself, and he's got a bunch of gaps in him now because he's pulled out so many blocks, and he's about to put the last block in his son, where he has got just one missing square. And that's the idea of that having kids propagates in a society. It's that we give up something so that our kids can have something. And a society without that is fundamentally broken. It's myopic. It has nothing to live for or to. And that's the direction we're moving. So it's a lot more than just financial insolvency, although that's a big tangible issue.
Well, it is. And I don't want people to think we're just kind of waxing eloquent here on this, even though I agree with everything you said. Like, the founder of the sociology department at Harvard University, one of the founding professors, was a guy named Patiram Sorokin. This was back in the 50s, before sociology became hijacked by Marxism. And Patiram Sorokin looked at every civilization of which we had record, Western and non-Western, developed, non-developed, or developing. And he basically put societies into three categories. One, and the middle one was kind of a hybrid between the two. It's not important. The two main categories were sensate cultures or ideational cultures. Ideational cultures are cultures that live for the future. They live for ideals. Think about the Islamic ideal of a caliphate, or think about, we hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, it's something out in front of us. A sensate culture lives for the moment, right? And, the distinguishing characteristic between cultures that were ideation or cultures that were sensate was this: what did they do with sex? Because if sex was seen as an act of immediate gratification, as opposed to if the sexual urge and instinct was largely contained with an institution of marriage, which had procreative potential, right? Then it became an ideational culture, because it was taking something that you wanted now and putting it into this larger context of marriage and children in the future. So it's, again, putting your thoughts, putting your vision out beyond the moment or the present. And so, in other words, he looked at every civilization on record, and he said, that's the difference. And cultures, and this is another contemporary of his that said cultures that, basically took sexuality and put into this long-term vision, ended up being cultures that were more prosperous. And in other words, it's kind of like, if you think about the future and you're investing as opposed to immediate gratification, you're probably going to do better in the long run. Same thing for cultures. I mean, this stuff really, really matters. People tell us all the time, like, you guys talk too much about sex. I'm like, I would love to stop talking about sex. I'm tired of it. But I don't think that there is a more successful social revolution in recent memory than the sexual revolution. And I don't think you can understand really what's at heart in our culture, the heart of the matters of what's going on, unless you understand this stuff between sex and babies and marriage and what we're doing with this triangle, what G.K. Chesterton called a triangle of truisms. It really does matter.
We're going to take another quick break here, folks. We'll be right back to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, it's time to move to a less meta international perspective here. We got a really tangible issue that we need to talk about here that was highlighted by Mindy Belts in World Magazine. And she says that this year, despite the pandemic lockdowns from COVID-19, more than 25,000 people have departed Syria, Libya, Yemen, and other trouble spots to make the dangerous journey across the Mediterranean to Greece and Spain and Italy and Cyprus and Malta. And their goal is to escape areas where primarily Islamic terrorists are pushing them out of their home regions, are persecuting them. And a lot of these people, I think in many cases, the predominant groups are Christian. And they're ending up packed in these refugee camps because the U.S. now has changed our policy. We're not taking them. So in 2015, the U.S. admitted more than 18,000 Christians from 50 countries that are ranked by Open Doors for persecuting Christians. In 2020, the number admitted to the U.S. from the same list, is projected to be 90% lower. In fact, a July report issued jointly by Open Doors USA and World Relief said, and this is a quote, "The U.S. government has fallen down on this issue." This is just a horrific failure and something that we've talked about before with Mindy here on the program. John, what do we need to do here to change this?
Well, first of all, we got to admit it, and it's hard because many people who agree with this administration on so many issues have a hard time pointing out sometimes where what this administration has done has been wrong. And I just want to point out a couple of things. First of all, in 2016, in the months coming up to the election, both President Trump and Vice President Pence made very specific promises about taking care of Christian refugees. Now, one of the things we can certainly say is that the president and the vice president have taken very clear public steps to protect life, which is something that we all agree with. They've taken very clear steps to protect religious liberty. In fact, international religious liberty. The appointment of Sam Brownback as the international ambassador, or the ambassador for international religious liberty, is a huge step. The annual, now 2 times in a row, convening on religious liberty to come up with a plan to expand religious liberty rights around the world is something that is an unprecedented step from any world leader, not to mention any president of the United States. So we're very thankful for that. At the same time, however, the tough on immigration stuff here has bled over into leaving Christians who are facing tremendous persecution around the world. And let's remind folks, right, what's the worst year on record for persecution of Christians in the history of the planet? 2019. What will be the worst year on record?
To be surpassed by 2020.
Because you know what? 2019 surpassed 2018 and 18 surpassed 17. In other words, this is a trend, and a lot of it has to do with China. Look, the way China is using this, never let a crisis go to waste sort of thing, and both the persecution of Muslim Uyghurs, but also churches. I think in the last few weeks, 10 or 15, these weren't even underground churches or illegal churches. These were legal churches that were torn down by the government for so-called violations. We talked about the Hong Kong protests just as recently as last week and the move there. But you can also talk about North Korea and certainly what's happening in Nigeria right now. And the fact of the matter is there are people who need to be relocated. Now, I'm not saying that they all should come to America. I'm not sure that's the case. There's other places in the world. But you know what, let's also say this, there are other places in the world that aren't opening their arms here. I'm grateful, for example, for Great Britain opening their arms to refugees from Hong Kong if they wanted to relocate. That's a huge step. We should be doing the same thing. Mainly because it would be, we all know that at many levels, the courage of the church has gone south below the equator, and some of these, and our African brothers and sisters are remarkable Christian leaders. Why, in one level, I'd love to have them, in the United States. But part of that is it's something that we can do. And let's repeat these numbers again. In 2015, the U.S. admitted more than 18,000 Christians from 50 countries that were ranked in the Open Doors World Watch list. All right, 18,000 just Christians in 2015. Now, I'll say that as one who often says that our immigration policy, particularly under democratic regimes, is something that I'm no fan of. And that's a problem that had to be fixed. I can fully agree with that. But let me just say this again, or what you said earlier. This year, in 2020, that number is going to go from 18,000 5 years ago to 950. Even though the persecution's getting worse, that is an incredible drop. And by the way, that's what we're on pace with now. There are some policies and procedures that are in the works that are going to limit it even more. So we could see a year 2020 with even less than 950 Christians relocated in what is the worst year on record for Christian persecution. Listen, pray about this. What we need to do is we need to talk to our representatives. We need to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters. We need to do whatever we can to serve these communities, either internationally or figure something out. And follow our friends at World Magazine. They've been covering this really well. Mindy Belts, who we have on the program a lot, she has her ear to the ground there, has been over in that area of the world more than anybody else I know, and at least in that capacity as a Christian. And, we'll link to her. Come to breakpoint.org.
We're here with segment 3 of the online version of Breakpoint this week, which has become our Q&A session here. John, we've got several questions this week, and we'll try to hit a couple of them here. And many of them are sort of in the same vein. People are wondering about political ideas that are floating around. How do they accord with biblical ideas, with the Christian worldview? Are they compatible? Are the moral claims here compatible with a Christian understanding of life and justice and politics and so forth? So we'll roll right into the first question here. A reader writes us, believing that God, through us, loves people of all races and cultures, how do we respond to pastors who fail to distinguish for their congregations this wonderful biblical truth from the very ungodly, unloving, and dangerous Marxist agenda behind the rioting? So this is a politically charged question here, but I think there's a important kernel here that we need to address.
Well, it is, and it's actually related maybe to some of the other questions we'll get to as well, which is I think right now we've got an issue where we're far more comfortable defining our positions by what we're not than what we are. And so when somebody does define what they are, it sounds too much maybe like something that we don't want to be. For example, it's not just Marxist that should be asking the questions about poverty or hunger or race or oppression or so on. We can ask those questions.
I seem to remember somebody at
Marxist.
some point who got up on a mountain and said a bunch of stuff about poor people and how we're supposed to treat them.
Yeah, he did, and so sometimes maybe we need to allow our pastors to make us uncomfortable. That was a break point even just recently that I did with Maria Baer, one of our writers, about do you want a pastor or do you want a parrot? And I think that's a really important thing. At the other side, on the other side of this, look, there has been a history of many seminaries, certainly mainline seminaries, but increasingly those that were more historically evangelical, that are relying on various forms of theological liberalism, especially having to do with the liberation sort of thinking, and an attempt to be charitable and an attempt to be wide-reaching and reading and so on. I think, by the way, that everybody who is kind of going after some sort of academic theological degree needs to at least engage at some level with the questions that some of these guys ask. But it's being done in a context too often without I think a really thorough, solid worldview analysis. For example, you can sit there and think theologically about the image of God, and not think textually about the image of God, and not think in terms of cultural application about the image of God. There's a lot of really interesting, heady, pointless theology that's been done about what the image of God is. But the idea that this is the central truth other than the existence of God himself that undergirds the whole narrative of Scripture, we got to figure out what the image of God is. Because if we don't know it, then we're going to miss the race question. We're going to miss the poverty question. We're going to miss the cultural power question. We're going to miss the unborn question. I also say this, I mean, there are far too many pastors, it seems, that are quick and willing to speak on those cultural issues upon which the culture has already decided. Going against kind of the larger culture is because, someone might be offended or something like that, is something that we don't have enough courageous pastors to do. I'm grateful for mine because he does it. But that's huge. I think that what has to happen is that there are some remarkable para-educational programs that need to be employed and encouraged for even seminary grads. I'm thinking of our friends at the Acton Institute and the work that they do at Acton University. I'm thinking, of course, of our Colson Fellows program, which many pastors have gone through and have found it extremely helpful on these sorts of issues in particular. How do we stand up for the least of these, but yet do it in a way that's biblically true instead of borrowing the wrong parts of dangerous other worldviews? And it's an important question. I don't think we're doing very well at it.
This goes along with the second question we got here, and this is a practical question. I think you've already actually answered this person, but it's good for the benefit of our listeners to hear this. This listener writes in, I'm having conversations with a friend about family structures. He's quite liberal. I'm wondering if you can refer me to any studies that show that the traditional family structure is the best for kids and the family as a whole. Just referring him to the Bible won't do the trick. So something that's sort of mainstream, secular, accessible to the secular mind, someone who doesn't necessarily saturate himself in Scripture, that will show the accessible truth that the family is the best way. The natural family, mother and father with children, is the best way for them to grow up.
So is it weird that I started to salivate a little bit when I saw this question? Because, it's interesting. Just last week, I was speaking for our friends over at Summit Ministries who have moved their summer training conferences to an online format. And I did a Q&A afterwards, and a girl said to me, why didn't you quote the Bible at all? And she had missed the first part of it. And I had told that, look, here's the question we're trying to ask and answer is marriage a thing like gravity instead of a thing like a speed limit? And what I mean by that is a speed limit is a speed limit. It's a social construct. It's not part of the natural moral order. It's something that humans devise, just like they do, whether you should drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road in order to advance, your society and life together. Many people think that's what the family is that it's a social construct, and that's all there is to it. But if it's a thing like gravity, then you can try to change it, but gravity wins, right? And if that's true, and so that's the approach that I take to this talk with the students. And I said, look, so if that's true, if marriage is a thing like gravity, if it's actually literally a part of the world, like it's built into the fabric of the universe itself, then of course the Bible will talk about it. But you should also be able to see it in the world like you see gravity, not just as kind of a common grace sort of thing, but literally, how do we figure out gravity? I think it was, Isaac Newton with an apple falling on his head, right?
That's the story.
That's the story. You know what I mean? But it basically came from literally seeing it in the world. Mm-hmm. And here's the good news for our questioner. There have been few things in the history of the world, few things certainly since we've been doing kind of modern Western research, that have been looked at more thoroughly than the family and the role of family in society. And it's actually been looked at two different ways, Shane. One is kind of really like on the ground, like what's the correlation between family and poverty, or family and school dropout, and family and risky sexual behavior, and family and whatever. And then it's also been looked at, and earlier in the program, we quoted Patiram Sorokin, him, Joseph Unwin, there's been a handful of others, have actually looked at it from a 30,000 foot view. In other words, what's the correlation between marriage and the success of an entire society?
Yeah.
And so the good news from our questioner is, yes, there's tons. So let me point you to 4 or 5, great, which we can look at without ever looking at the Bible. First, if you want to do this in a real quick way that you could get and you could read, the chapter in the book that Sean McDowell and I wrote on same-sex marriage deals with this, because we wanted to know. You might remember, Shane, the whole same-sex marriage movement advanced on two words: marriage equality.
Yeah.
And I think everybody believes in marriage equality, but you don't know what's equal to marriage unless you know what marriage is, right? So that's the approach we took in the book. It's like, stop saying marriage equality until you first know what marriage is. And so we did that. And so the chapter in there, we have a chapter in there, leaving God out of it. Like, we don't even refer to theology, philosophy, biblical text, or anything like that. What can you come up with when it comes to marriage? Our friend Michael Craven, our colleague at the Colson Center, has written a book years ago that deals with this same sort of data set, especially at that 40 or 50,000 foot view. And again, we'll link to all of these at the Colson Center if you come to breakpoint.org. But I want to point to two other things that are on the ground immediate that could be really helpful for our questioner. Shane, one is an article from 2009 in Time magazine called "Is There Hope for the American Marriage?" Because, and I point to this article, the author's name is Caitlin Flanagan. We'll link to it at breakpoint.org. So there's two reasons really I like to point to this article. Number one is the sheer amount of data and research and studying that Caitlin Flanagan did in order to write this article. She points to an amazing array of research on the family and marriage in particular, including by hostile researchers who actually intended in their data to prove that marriage was a patriarchal institution or oppressive to women or whatever, and came up with the exact opposite conclusion. The second reason I point to this article is because it was in 2009. And I know first that sounds like ancient history because it's been 11 years. But here's the trick. In 2009, President Obama was still against same-sex marriage. In other words, this was an article written before the entire conversation about marriage and family got hijacked by the LGBT movement. So now you can't have a conversation looking at the real data, looking at the real studies without offending someone that's part of that acronym. And so we haven't been able to be honest, right? To say whatever is to be hateful, to be intolerant, to be bigoted. And what I appreciate about this is that this looks at marriage without all the other noise that's been brought in the last 10 years. One more article I'll point to for our listener, which is great. Sorry, not an article, one more source is our friends at the Heritage Foundation have compiled the data on family. Any study that you can think of that's ever been done on the family is collated, categorized at a website called familyfacts.org, FACTS, familyfacts.org. And it's a wonderful resource. I always tell students, you should send me a check for recommending this website to you, because I've just saved you all the research time you need to do when you write a paper. I mean, like, if there's a study done on obesity, childhood obesity in family, or, what grades you get in school and marriage status, it's all put on that site. It's a remarkable source.
And John, what you opened with is so important. The realization that marriage and family, as we define it as Christians, these aren't theologically revealed truths. These aren't things that were, imposed from outside or added from outside via special revelation. These were things that are part of creation and are accessible to all people via ordinary means. This is what Paul was talking about when he said that, God's invisible power and attributes are evident to all based on the creation. It's on that same level. Marriage is part of who we are. It's exactly the same sort of thing as gravity. It's testable, it's observable. This is the way the human machine, as Lewis put it, is meant to function. And if we don't function this way, we're going to pay the price for it. It turns out there is no other way consistently to order our reproduction and our passing on to the next generation of our culture and society. It has to be through the family, or else there's going to be dire consequences. So I would emphasize that above all. Not that you don't eventually lead people to Scripture and say, well, yeah, the truth about everything is contained in here, but you can start just on the natural facts, just on the observables, and that is scientifically verifiable. So check out all those resources John mentioned. We got one more question here we want to try to get to. A listener writes in, John, and this is related a little bit to the first question, but it's another issue that many people right now are grappling with because of all the moral claims floating around in our culture right now. Listener writes in asking about an anti-poverty campaign with a list of demands and core values submitted to the two major parties, Republicans and Democrats. And this listener says, I looked over the website and some of the concepts sound plausible and even reasonable, but the site demands an end to the, quote, the false narrative of religious nationalism that focuses on prayer in school, abortion, and gun rights to distract from the real issue of poverty. And the listener asks, I'm sure this sounds appealing to many at face value. However, upon reading the demands closely, it seems like it could also lead to all-encompassing socialism. And this listener asks for a response to this campaign so that people like myself who want to help and support the poverty-stricken can make an informed decision here without falling into an ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, if you go to the organization Black Lives Matter,
Right.
and you see their values that they want to deconstruct the family and advance transgender rights, and you think, I don't understand why these things fit together.
Why is that
and the
connected?
same thing
Yeah.
is in this question. Yeah, what does religious nationalism have to do with poverty? In fact, I mean, the good news for our questioner here, our listener, is that there has been a response to this. It's the last 3 decades of human history, literally is the answer that this listener is looking for. Because in the last 3 decades in human history, literally the last 30 years, the global abject poverty rate has been cut in half. What I mean by abject poverty is starvation level poverty, right? I mean, in America, poverty tends to be relative poverty, where you draw a line of income and anyone below that line is poor. What I'm talking about is the sort of poverty that we used to grow up watching, whole TV specials about, with heartbreaking images of children and things like that. And we have had a growing middle class and nations all across America, particularly some of the most war-torn and ravaged nations in the world. Now, and what's fascinating about this is almost always, the worst poverty in the world right now is associated with those that have a lack of freedom, a lack of religious freedom, a lack of political freedom, and a lack of economic freedom. But it's not just that we can point to that's not working. We can actually point to what has worked. And listen, if you don't trust me, just trust Bono, right? I mean, you got to trust you too. What did he say? He said the answer to poverty is capitalism. He said that, a rocker, like who's not necessarily a conservative on very many things. And the reason is because it has worked. When you have freedom, when you have opportunity, when you have the rule of law, when you have access to capital and resources, then people are, as we put it in a recent commentary, people are the solution to their own poverty problem. And that's the answer to this. I wouldn't say the answer is trying to shoot down every red herring that some of these progressive campaigns send up, right? Like when somebody says, we've got to put an end to poverty, and so let's deal with gun rights. I mean, that's just a waste of time to respond to, in my view. But what you can do is hold up what works. And I'll point you to a couple wonderful resources for this. The book that was written by Ron Nash, a wonderful philosopher who's passed years ago, called Poverty and Wealth. He begins that book by saying we have to help the poor with our head, not just our heart. I would say that the more recent book by Wayne Grudem and Barry Asmus, called the Poverty of Nations, what makes the difference between nations that are wealthy and nations that are poor, is a wonderful resource. My favorite on this is by Darrow Miller. It's one of the original worldview thinkers out of YWAM. A wonderful guy, Darrow Miller. And I am blanking completely on the name of that book. And it's so important, Shane, while we're actually talking and recording, I am going to Google it, because it literally is one of my favorite books. And is it
called It Doesn't Start Where You Think?
No, that's not it. It's a classic.
An article by Darrow Miller.
Yeah, no, his organization is just stunning.
Discipling Nations?
Discipling Nations. That's the one. Discipling Nations.
Power of Truth Transform Cultures.
And I'm telling you, his look at what makes a difference in these cultures. And you know what? At the forefront, of people who have made the biggest difference in global poverty have been Christians that have provided access to capital, Christians that have protected the rule of law, Christians that have fought for religious liberty. There's just so much wrong with this question. I mean, not the question, but this whole idea that
The assertion behind the assertion that this questioner is encountering, right? And I would add that it's a false dilemma. First of all, is the idea that you can't address issue B because issue A is so important. That's the kind of nonsense that the pro-life movement has to deal with all the time. That
right.
If there's if there's poverty or injustice in this area of society, you can't deal with the fact that babies are being killed. Well, no, we can, as you say, often walk and chew gum at the same time. We can deal with these issues in their own way and in their own rights. There's no reason we have to choose between them. But John, what you're saying is, to me, the crucial component, and it's what so many of those who are zealous about ending poverty overlook, what they're just seriously missing, and that is that poverty is the result of a series of factors that are rooted deep in how a culture is structured and what its beliefs are and what it values. It's not just an economic problem. It's not just something you can throw money at. Like if you just dump a bunch of checks on people, it's not going to solve the root issue. The old axiom that you can give a man a fish and he'll be fed for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll be fed for a lifetime. It's not just about helping people learn how to work. It's about helping people learn how to pass on wealth to their children. It's about helping governments become less corrupt, so that the rule of law can triumph. It's about having a functioning legal system. And it's about, like you said, religious freedom and freedom to express ideas, because even though it doesn't sound like that would be immediately connected to poverty, it turns out it is. Turns out those first freedoms
completely.
of the Constitution are a really big deal, and they have downstream effects when it comes to economic outcomes for people.
Oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter if you teach a man to fish, if the government takes whatever fishes he catch or, whatever fish he catches. Yeah. So the other resource too, by the way, that's wonderful. And this actually has been chosen as a winner at both left-leaning and right-leaning film festivals.
Okay.
This is what tells you, is Poverty Cure by the Acton Institute guys. There's a documentary, Poverty Cure, which actually comes endorsed by none other than Michael Moore, believe it or not, because they're basically they're pointing out how international aid, right, especially of the secular kind, the government top-down kind, the kind that leads to an all-encompassing socialism, how that's actually become a scam. And that what's actually helped is, again, return of the rule of law, return of access to capital, and these market principles, and the sort of freedom that allows people to solve their own problems. When you see people as the object of your pity, rather than as the subject in their own story before God, it makes, that's all the difference in the world. And so anyway, that's what I would say to this listener. And there's just so many good things. Again, the name of that film is called Poverty Cure. And it's a remarkable film and documentary, and it's also a educational series. You can buy either one.
Well, John, your response there was really impoverished. You didn't have anything to say. I was hoping you'd have a lot more resources at hand and a lot more recommendations, but you can work on it. Get better for next time.
I can point to some other books. I have no original thoughts, but I know a whole lot of really good ones.
Well, folks, thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all the resources and stories that John and I have mentioned today on the program. It's a treasure trove of information and commentary, and it's updated every single day. We'll be back next week to talk more about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Thanks so much for listening.